Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Zenitsu, and you're listening to the Digi Talks podcast, the show that covers various topics from news to meta developments and everything in between for the fine folks who love the Digimon trading card game. Just as a quick reminder, I do stream this live over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu. It's also uploaded as a YouTube video under the YouTube channel of Zenitsu, on top of being on various podcasting platforms like Spotify for your viewing and listening pleasure. Please feel free to leave a like, rating, follow, subscribe, hit that noti bell, and do everything else in order to stay up to date when the podcast goes live and to help support the podcast itself. So today I am back with a special guest, Mark. He's been on the podcast a couple of times before, more so for the design topics, and we are going to be talking about staples. But before we get into the topic of staples, first we do have some metadata that we're going to be taking a look at. There was technically 2 events that happened this past weekend, but unfortunately we only have the metadata for one of those events. That event that we actually have the data for is going to be a Top Cut in-person regional. This was held in Illinois, and it seemed like it was a pretty decent event considering it was 212 players and 8 rounds of Swiss. Technically, this event had the ability to end the event after 7 rounds, but because of Bandai's new rule on how they want tournaments to go, they were all forced to play out the last 8th round. But regardless, as far as the archetype breakdown, this is where things get a little bit more divisive and kind of the, not necessarily I told you so, but the direction that the meta was headed, which definitely is a huge consolidation. There's probably realistically in this format as of right now, based on all of the different events that we had, only about 5 decks that are actually meta competitive, and then everything else is kind of just scrambling to be able to get into top 16. As far as the archetype breakdown, this does kind of reflect what the meta direction is headed towards, and it's not necessarily the greatest meta that we've ever seen, considering 9 Numemon were in top 16. There was 2 yellow vaccine. This is Magnamon X yellow vaccine, not just any hodgepodge yellow vaccine that we saw previously. Then we had 2 Imperials, 1 Magnamon, so that's going to be Blue Magnamon X. And then we also had 1 Machinedramon and 1 Mirage. So as far as the 5 decks that I kind of was referring to in terms of what's actually meta competitive, well, they're all here, and Machinedramon is the big outlier that we're going to be taking a look at. But before we get into talking about Machinedramon, as far as what actually won the event, that was a Numemon. Then 2nd through 4th place were also Numemons, so top 4 was all the same deck. 5th place was Imperial, 6th was Magnamon X, 7th was Yellow Vaccine, 8th was Machinedramon, 9th was Numemon, 10th was Mirage, 11th was Numemon, 12th was Imperial, 13th and 14th were both Numemon, 15th was Yellow Vaccine, and 16th was another Numemon. Then when we actually start taking a look into why Machinedramon was as successful as it was, well, it kind of is another I told you so situation where I do attribute a lot of this deck's overall success to Ukamon. So this player decided to run not necessarily 8 Ukamon, they ran 7 Ukamon, but for all intents and purposes, the fact that they were capitalizing and maximizing on the Ukamon engine really does show the overall power and strength of what Ukamon can bring to virtually any deck that doesn't necessarily have a dedicated low end. So to compensate for the fact that they're not trying to do this whole traditional evolution style gameplay, instead they are just electing to fall back to what EX1 Machinedramon was doing and just say, hey, I'm actually a hard play style deck. I'm just going to try to hard play my Machinedramon and have my trash nice and full with different Cyborg level 5 Digimon for me to just grab, fill up my inheritables with, gain the extra memory to make the card as cheap as possible, and, well, just build a very powerful Digimon with all of the different abilities. They're utilizing Demi-Meramon as a way to try to help fill up the trash in combination with Ukamon, and they don't necessarily care about the fact that Hagurumon can't Digivolve on top of Demi-Mera because it's just an on-play effect that they're trying to gain to, well, search their deck for more cyborgs and more tamers. tamers, which Ukamon is also helping look for tamers, the BT16 one, while also helping look for Digimon. You get a nice little consistency package that actually really helps to accelerate the deck. Then you also have the promo Ukamon to help gain you memory to be even more memory efficient on specific turns, especially since you also are going to be wanting to use Analog Man, again, continuing the whole cycling, drawing, and memory gain value. Then it's just still going to default to a lot of what we've seen with Machine Dramon, where it's just using Chaos Dramon to go on top and Chaosmon X Antibody to also go on top. And the reason why I think that Machine Dramon is actually pretty decent is because there is just a lot of DP reduction, and the EX1 Machine Dramon kind of prevents its DP from being reduced, which does spread into the Chaos Dramon X Antibody. So you could really build a very powerful Digimon, especially since we have so many different level 5s to be able to customize with whatever abilities we kind of just want. Combine that with more consistency, cycling, and an overall better value engine than what trying to line up a stack is doing, just because there is some minor inconsistencies with trying to build a stack, and this kind of just takes a lot of those out of the equation. Yes, it is a little bit more expensive on some of your plays, but it definitely seems like it's paying off in dividends, considering this player was able to get into 8th place. But I think that this is the type of creativity that both is good utilizing Ukamon and bad, because this is mostly possible because of Ukamon, and Ukamon is really forcing the direction of the game to be centered around specific styles of play and specific card types being used. So, with the question of the week, what is actually a staple? So, Mark, what do you define as a staple?
Well, I guess in my mind, first thing that I think of when somebody mentions staples, I just think of something that you just literally can just throw in any deck because it's just good enough to just exist. I mean, doesn't matter what type of deck it is, it just works. It's just something that's good all around. Doesn't matter color, archetype. It just works.
Yeah, I like to overanalyze things. So to me, a staple means something probably different than a lot of other people. Because the way I define staple is I break it down by different levels. So I have like staples that are on the game level. So to me, these are staples that are basically trying to fix some sort of issue with the game or make the gameplay smoother. This is obviously the most strongest level of staple, being the impacting the game on its own merit. Then you get stuff like colored staples or world staples, depending on the type of game that you're playing, where it's a good card, but only in that specific color, world, faction, what be it. Then you got archetype staples, which is basically the next step down, where it's just like, okay, magic, elves are usually a green thing, but you're not going to play a elf tribal specific card in something that cares about, let's just say, beasts. So it doesn't make sense. So you got archetype staples as the next step down, and then the next step below that are like the more hyper-specific staples, even more specific than archetypes, which are like almost deck-dedicated staples, which is like, going to the engine of the deck and how it functions. So that's kind of my general breakdown on how I define staples.
So you're looking at staples at a whole different spectrum across the board of here's your universal staples. They can be run in any deck. Then you just break it down even further from there until you get to like the very specific staples of, yeah, if you are running this one specific type of deck, you're probably going to see these cards, but only in these types of decks.
Correct. So like Digimon is a game that isn't anything special when it comes to how they treat their staples, and it's the same type of level of breakdown that I kind of have just been explaining. So like, just as an example, if you are playing a Vmon deck, there's a high chance that you're going to have a VMon specific card. That's going to be like your engine piece. Then you're going to have like some more generic level of cards. That's usually like the BTO3 Davis, because he's not just specifically for VMon, he's just specifically blue. So he's like a blue level staple. Then you're going to have stuff like the training cards, which is a little bit more on the game level, where it's just like, okay, I kind of need these in order to be on pace with everyone else. And that's kind of just the spectrum on how I look at what cards are needed in what quantity in what amount, on top of what the deck is allowed to run because of the different engines that it's working with. So something like BT13 Royal Knights can't necessarily play some certain staples, but what they don't have the ability to do themselves, the deck and engine generally tries to make up those gaps. And with the Demon Lords deck, that's basically going to be Royal Knights 2.0. It's kind of mirroring that same type of sentiment, where it's just like, okay, you can't run the game-specific staples, but we'll make up for that in other areas.
Right, that way the deck is still somewhat viable, despite the fact that it can't run cards that you would normally see in those types of decks.
Correct. And Digimon as a game has been introducing more and more staples on the higher levels, which are impacting more than just decks themselves. It's impacting the entire game, which is arguably the most dangerous place that you want to be like building and designing cards around, because too many staples can actually ruin the deck building experience, deck design, and fundamentally warp the foundation of the entire game itself around the existence of the card. So I came from a dead card game. You could go back on my YouTube channel and look. It's called Buddy Fight, and towards the end of the game, they started introducing like world level staples, where it's just like, you have to run this card, otherwise you're not competitively viable of a deck. And it just really sucked, because I saw the power creep ramp up from probably about a 7 or 8 to about 10 or 12, where it really just had a very profound impact on the game. And right now, Digimon is not necessarily looking to emulate that, but they're starting to dip their toes into those types of waters.
Right, because the second that you start introducing too many, as you call them, world level staples, you're going to see them in every single deck. And if, a few of them I definitely see as helpful for the game, especially when, certain colors don't have access to certain things. And it's like, okay, well, we're just going to create this staple because all of the decks want access to this tech. So why don't we just create a card that they can all access? But the point that I'm assuming that you're getting at is when more than, every single deck is running these staples, you're going to see them in every single deck. And then it gets to the point where it's like, well, shit, half my deck is just universal staples. There's no thought that goes into this deck building process, because it's literally, hey, 60% of my deck is already built. Now I just throw in the other, 40%. And it might not even be 40% at that point, because, depending on what archetype or color you're going with, that could already be almost completely decided. So it's just like, well, there's 90% of the deck. Now I just want to throw in 10 cards that I think will do what I want them to do, and bam, there's my deck.
And unfortunately, that is where Yu-Gi-Oh! Is at. That's why a lot of people just do not like Yu-Gi-Oh! Is because the power level is already up to 15, which is not necessarily the healthiest of levels. But yes, you do have just a core set of cards that you have to run in borderline almost any and every competitively viable deck. And if you don't, then it just kind of sucks. And again, that takes away towards the deck building experience, because it's a similar thing with Dragon Ball Super Masters. Yeah, they have a similar thing where, yeah, you start with your staples for your color or what you're doing, and then you just kind of pick whatever engine you're playing with, which is determined mostly based on your leader and whatever support cards you're playing. And then there's already 70% of your deck already pre-established and built for you. And you didn't even have to put any thought or effort into it. And Yu-Gi-Oh! Is in a similar vein where it's just like, here's my archetype that I'm playing. That's about 30% of the deck. Here's my staple package. That's about 40% of the deck. And then this last, like, 30% just goes to whatever you feel like will better support either the staples or the engine itself. And that's partially why those games feel really awful to kind of play and really hard to get into, is just understanding what those are and how to best implement them on top of everything else that a legacy style game like that has established.
Well, and once you have, too many staple cards, it also, and, a large chunk of your deck has already been predefined on what's going into it. It leaves very little, like you said, creativity for doing deck building. And arguably, I would say that's something that definitely can separate, your average player from perhaps your more like semi-pro pro player, because those players that, they're going into it, the deck building process can be very crucial, and little things here or there in different deck profiles can have huge impacts on how their game performance can work, how they can handle certain matchups better. Maybe they can just find tech that makes the deck work better than what, the more like base package is already trying to do. And the more room you have to play with in that space, I feel like the more variance that you'll find, uh, the more experimentation that can be done to find what works well, what doesn't work well, what just doesn't seem like it should function, but for some magical reason just always seems to just pop off.
Yeah, and like, this isn't just me saying staples are bad, because they're obviously there for a very specific reason, whether it's counter tech staples or enhancement staples, because those are two subcategories to it. Because stuff like the memory boosts and training cards for Digimon, those are enhancement type staples. They are here to enhance the experience. What they're trying to do is solve a particular problem, that being a consistency problem mostly, on trying to make sure that you have a good generic card that can slot into any color based on which training and boost you're running, and then you're good to go. You have a 6 card little package. Most of the time it's 4 training cards and 2 memory boosts. And then they're introducing scrambles as a kind of catch-up mechanic in a way, where it's just like, the idea of it is, okay, you're down, but you're not out because you have this card set up. So that's the idea on scrambles, is to try to get you back into the game because of the high level of removal that Digimon generally plays around with. Then you get stuff like Ukamon, where that's another enhancement type staple. But all of the floodgates, just as an example, are more disruptive level staples, where I'm only running this because it's to try to counter the opponent's strategy, not to enhance my own gameplay, but to try to ruin the opponent's game plan. And both Dragon Ball Super Masters and Yu-Gi-Oh! Are very notorious on more so not enhancement staples. They do have them, like all of your pots of whatever, but they also do have their fair share of floodgates, like the Nibiru's, the Effect Veilers, and the Ash Blossoms.
So
So
would you say that the resource ones are less problematic than the floodgates, or?
they're both problematic in their own different ways, because if you make a floodgate too good, then everyone wants to run it. But if you make a resource engine and resource value package too good, then everyone's already going to run it. And then whoever can't run it now becomes basically unplayable, which is what we have seen happen with Black War Greymon and War Greymon respectively. It's like, oh, I want to use the training cards, but my deck is red, but my tamers are black, so the chances of me whiffing are actually higher than what I'm reasonably comfortable with using, so therefore I can't use the card, which means now I'm being slower than every other deck by comparison, so I'm not meta viable anymore, because I can't run the specific staple. And the way the deck is designed doesn't allow you to not run it. So it's just like, it's a deck that clearly wanted to but couldn't because of the limitations.
Right. So in a format that's fairly well dominated with OTK rush decks, the slowness pushing those decks into more of what you would consider mid range just makes them too slow, and it doesn't make them necessarily viable enough to take out the long con control decks.
Right. And each different style of deck can use the staples to their own benefits if they can run them. So it's like in the way on base, like the training cards are designed, is they promote and support the idea of OTK decks more than just actually just, oh, I need to use this to try to find a card. It's like, no, I need to use the secondary ability to be able to accelerate my combo. So, like, that goes to just a sheer oversight in design where they think that the card is being used one specific way, but reality is that players are using it and approaching the card in a completely unintended way that is having a bigger effect on the game itself because of how important that staple is based on the level that it's at.
Oh no, the players are using cards in a way that the designers didn't intend. A shocker.
I know it's only a very age-old thing, which is why I had like huge respect for Magic the Gathering like a couple of years ago because they actually acknowledged this problem where they were just like, "Oh, artifacts being colorless is actually a huge issue that's really harming the overall health of the game. Let's try reducing the amount of colorless artifacts that we're going to be printing," and then they started printing colored artifacts, which innately has its own sets of limitations because they are now colored, which means only decks that are using that specific color will be able to play them. So like Commander as an example it's the most popular Magic the Gathering format, but if you look at the sheer amount of just colorless artifact staples that most decks are generally running, it's incredibly astonishing on like how these types of staples can have a profound impact on the game itself. So like obviously being a big commander player, the number one artifact that every single deck is going to be running is Soul Ring. Then they printed Arcane Signet, then they also printed something like Command Sphere, and like the list goes on and on. Like I literally have a list of like 100 different artifacts that are all basically any deck can kind of run it. Like the One Ring, Mana Crypt, Chromatic Lantern, like Sensei's Divining Top. There's no real deck that is not wanting to use those cards because of just how good they are at what they're doing.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of those cards, they're at least the ones that you named off, they're all really cheap to play. They provide insane value. I mean, Soul Ring is just crazy. Yeah, I pay one to play an artifact that I can now tap for two colorless mana. I'm just gonna I can start rushing. I can start playing my big stuff. I have access to so many things, which I don't think Soul Ring's a bad thing because when you take into consideration with most commander decks, green being a color that's built around ramping so it can get to the big stuff fast, Soul Ring kind of gives the other colors that don't have those kind of ramping options a little bit of like a safety net of, oh hey, this player's green, it's turn 4, this man already has 9 mana, I need help, I feel like I'm in danger. So it kind of gives, it's a nice staple to give all of the colors a little bit of that that same level, to be on that same level as this other color that is very proficient in this one thing that most of the other colors don't have. But like you said, because it's so good, everybody's going to run it. There's really no reason not to.
Right, and right now, Ukuman is kind of in that same level of territory where even decks you might not think are able to use a generic searcher and the best turn one play in the entire game, they can. Spoiler. So like in terms of both of them, it's just an incredibly powerful package that them being able to be used in almost every single deck because of the colorless evolution. Yes, the drawback is the fact that you can't digivolve on top of them. That's not necessarily a drawback when you're just using it as a resource value tool that's hyper cheap and hyper efficient. So like I have a huge problem with training cards more specifically than memory boosts because of cost. Like I honestly think like cost is a balancing tool. This should be absolutely shocker to absolutely no one, where the higher amount that you're going to be investing in a single card, the more you want out of that card. But when you have training cards undermining memory boosts because they do and fulfill literally the exact same role, but training boosts are cheaper and more efficient of a searching tool because if they can hit more different targets, sure, you don't search as deep, but the fact that they just do more for less really doesn't necessarily put memory boosts into a good spot in terms of wanting to be used, but we use it also because we see it as basically extra copies of the other staple. So it's stuff like that that just warps the foundation of the game because now we're all centered around the usage of these types of cards. And the more we are forced to use these types of cards, the more they're going to have an impact on the game overall. And right now, Digimon is in its infancy when it comes to creating these staples. Like, we have a ton of archetype-based staples. Like, any Agumon deck is going to run an Agumon that searches for your Greymons. Like, that's just a no-brainer. A lot of decks have this a level of homogenization for their own specific deck. It's just, once we get past that, and now every single deck is going to be using this specific style or type of card, that's when we get a problem. Like, when everyone is saying, oh, the best counter to Ukumon is just running Digimon Emperor, so now everyone is forced to run Digimon Emperor, which is a pseudo staple in of itself, to try to counter an actual staple. Like, now we're getting into like territory that is kind of dangerous to be playing with.
Well, and I know in the concept of Magic, a lot of times, at least in the much older sets, I can't really say I feel the same with some of the more recent sets, but in a lot of the older sets, I feel like the colorless artifacts, a common theme with most of the artifacts, not all of them, but most of them, is generally whatever it does, you're usually paying just a little bit extra than whatever color may have access to this thing that the artifact is giving you. So say that like I can't think of an artifact off the top of my head, but let's just say for this example, red has like lightning bolt. It's pay 1 red, deal 3 damage. And if you were going to give that to a colorless artifact, a lot of times it would be like, oh, well, you have to pay 2, or we'll put it on like a 2-drop artifact, and then you pay 1 and you can tap it to deal damage. But the idea being is,
Or
because
Meteorite.
yeah, right. So basically the idea is, oh, hey, we'll give everybody access to this, but we're not going to give you the same value for cost that a specific color may have access to for this card, because then it incentivizes the color that has access to it. Like, hey, if you want to use this color has a much better value for cost version of it, but we're going to give it to everybody at a like, I would think of it as more of like a just below the curve value. Yes, you're not getting a ton of value out of this that you could possibly get for the cost, but it might be something that your color doesn't have access to. I'm going to look at green and say, hey, green, you need something to deal with the flyers. Here's a flying artifact. It might not be that great, but when somebody's swinging at you with a frickin' 4/4 angel flying vigilance in the air, it's not a bad thing to have.
Right. I think like to double down on your example, probably the best like example is going back to green. Cultivate, adding 1 land into your hand, and 1 goes onto the battlefield tapped. You have Solemn Simulacrum, which is a creature, not a spell, so a little bit of a difference there, but you still get to on enter the battlefield or on play, search for a land and put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then when it dies, you draw a card. So you're still kind of getting a card into your hand. It's just the creature has to leave in order to get that effect. So that's probably like the best base level comparison to that example.
Well, actually, if you want a better comparison for that, you might want to go with Burnished Heart, being a 3-dropped artifact creature that you then have to pay. Is it? I don't know. Do you have to
It's
pay 3
three.
for? Is it
Yeah.
pay 3, sack it, and then you can basically perform a cultivate?
Uh well, the both lands go onto the battlefield, but it costs 3 to play the card and then you have to pay another 3 to sack it. So it's still like you're paying double the in total mana spent in order to get a similar style of effect. Yes.
But it goes back to the point of, hey, this is something that everybody has access to, but green has the better value for cost version. So if you really like this effect, run green.
Right. And other card games kind of do something similar where they'll try to like if they are going to be making like a negate type of effect where it's just like, "Hey, I'm going to shut down that attack. I'm going to stop or just end the attack because I'm going back to like Dragon Ball as an example. Like there's a ton of cards that just say end the attack for each color. Each one has their own little attack floodgate. And that same thing is true in a game like Buddy Fight as well, where they label those as shields, and each color or each world has their own specific shield, and then they have archetype specific ones, and it kind of just goes from there, all basically doing the exact same thing on just trying to mitigate with a problem that the opponent is trying to present. And you're kind of forced to run those because if you don't, now you're just opening yourself up to be absolutely punished. And with games being as fast as they are for both of those example games, it really just goes to show that, like, when they do something incredibly stupid with the design of the game, like including too much aggro and rush, just as an example in both of those cases, then they need some way to be able to counterbalance that, which is where these staples start to emerge on that level. With Digimon, there was a whole slew of design issues that they acknowledged, and that's why they printed cards like Scramble. That's why they printed the memory boost and the training cards, is all to try to fix a particular problem with the game, which is good that they acknowledge that, but it's bad that now we're all forced to kind of play this, and these staples also act as like a little gatekeeping mechanism as well, monetarily, because if you don't have those types of cards currently in circulation, then the price of those cards goes up because everyone is using them. And then that could start pricing players out. So that, like, there's been this growing sentiment that Digimon's been getting slowly more expensive. And this is a contributing factor to why we feel that way, is because we have more staples that are in demand. Whereas memory boosts, we got a really big reprint wave, and they were reprinted a couple of times, and they kept reprinting it, and the value of those cards are really low compared to something like the training cards, which are a little bit higher. And that's why Ukamon, when the promo first came out, was at a very high price because of what that card was doing and its overall impact on the game itself.
Oh, yeah. Because if a card becomes a staple and it's run in every deck, obviously it's like, well, I need to run 4 copies of this card. I got to go out and get 4 copies. If I didn't crack them in packs, and off to the secondary market I go. And if people know that a card's a staple and everybody's going to need it, I mean, to a certain extent, you can just kind of raise the price and kind of see what people are willing to pay. Because, I mean, if there's a scarcity of the card, then if somebody really wants it, I mean, I'm sure that you could get them to pay above, market value for those cards, which for the players isn't all that, all that great in my opinion, because it's like, well, the game should be accessible. You shouldn't have to go out and, I mean, I remember when I first got into Magic, the common classic saying was like, hey, if you want to play in the standard format, you basically have to be looking at dropping, at least $200 to $500 every couple of months to keep your deck updated, because there's going to be new staples that come out for your deck, and oh, guess what? They're not going to be cheap because people know that they're staples.
Well, Magic also has its own additional level of staple because of their resource system with lands. Like, lands actually, in my perspective, is what is ruining Magic the Gathering because of just how they function and what they're doing. Because it's like, oh, you're not a modern deck unless you're playing your colored specific fetches. And then that is what caused the fetches to be super high priced for a very long time, and now they're starting to reprint them a little bit more thanks to just a set dedicated to that format, and that's helping quell the price down. But in the meantime, looking at standard, certain lands are in circulation that don't have a reprint, and those lands are going to go up and up and up in value. Like the Triomes, just as an example. We haven't really seen any reprints on those, and they just kept climbing because of the uniqueness of what that land was doing. And because that's the resource system of the game, you have to have that card, which is why a lot of other games, like One Piece with its Dawn system, like Dragon Ball Super, being able to put cards from your hand into an energy zone. Like, games have found an alternative way to be able to mitigate that, so that way it doesn't make the game as unaccessible as Magic at times. Because the number one thing somebody like Tolarian Community College always complains about in all of the precons is, how is the land base? Is the mana base good enough to actually support this deck? How much am I actually going to have to invest in that mana base in order to get it to be where it needs to be? And that's just the worst part of Magic in my perspective.
Right, because all the examples you gave of other card games, essentially their quote unquote resource system is just any just card in your deck. I mean, it's a lot like in Weiss Schwarz. When you swing, you just take the top card of your deck. Doesn't matter what it is, but you slam it down into stock, and bam, now that's my resource for playing my more expensive cards, my really good cards, playing all sorts of stuff. But once it's used up, it goes out of there and goes back into the deck. So then you have that argument of like, well, how much, does this deck want to build stock to help kind of compress the deck so it can cancel damage, versus does this deck just want to go full gas and it doesn't care, it just needs to pay that stuff out to just keep pushing its opponent. So Magic is definitely unique in that perspective, because your resource system is tied to highly specific cards in your deck, and I think that also definitely makes a lot of uniqueness in the deck building that's available to Magic, because it's like, well, how do you balance your this resource system with cards that actually do something functional for you? But at the same time, it's like that's kind of a crux, because land tends to be something that's really expensive to buy. I mean, I remember way back in the day, fetch lands, I mean, even the cheap fetch lands were pushing, almost $100 a piece. And it's like, well, crap, this modern deck pretty much calls for a staple of, I need 8 fetch lands, because Lord knows this game's going to be over in at least 4 turns. And if it's not over in 4 turns, somebody's just going to start scrambling.
Right, and I know Pokemon has a energy system that's kind of similar to Magic, but they don't go absolutely ham with all of like the special energies. They do have some special energies, but it's not like an absurdly abundant amount where that is defining the entire game. I mean, it could, depending on what the energy type is and the legality of it, but that goes to show that just from a resource system alone can decide what kind of staples are needed, because you get a game like Yu-Gi-Oh, which has zero resource system outside of the cards in your deck and the rules of the game, and that's why you get like some incredibly and absurdly broken stuff coming out of Yu-Gi-Oh more often than any other game is because it doesn't have a resource system. A lot of games, their power creep comes from them trying to find ways to cheat on their resource system. Like Gecko Moria in One Piece is an incredibly stupid card because it's a big body that plays another semi-big body that also could then cascade into another type of effect, and it's cheating on its resource system because of just the ability that it has to free play other cards when they initially have a cost tied to them. So it's like for that 8 Dawn play, you're actually getting 12 to more Dawn's worth of value out of that card, and that's where games are trying to cheat on their resource system. That's why, like, all the way back in BT5 with Digimon, Lord Nightmon was like this absolute nigh invincible thing that was just very hard to deal with, was because it was one of the first examples we had on cheating on the resource system of the game, next to Green and Hidden Potential Discovered, but they quickly and efficiently realized both Digisorption and Hidden Potential were incredibly stupid, so they limited those as quickly as they could. Well, less so on the Digisorption, more so on Hidden Potential. But that's why Mega Digimon Fusion was the only banned card, was because of how much it was egregiously cheating on the resource system. And it seems like that's the, like, as much as I hate to say that's the goal of the designers, is how much they can get away with on cheating the game. That's just what they generally do to try to create more interesting cards. Sometimes that's for a good thing, and sometimes that's for a bad thing, like Ace Digimon. Ace Digimon are their own level of staple because, well, they're getting stronger and stronger. We went from monocolor aces to two-color aces, and now we have, like, DNA aces, which are more deck-specific aces, and it's starting to get a little bit out of hand, where aces are getting more and more valuable because of the higher levels of impact that they're having versus when they first initially started. And even though, yes, aces do have a drawback, it's still a very powerful ability for Digimon to have and to be playing around with.
Right. It still falls on that on the value curve of, for what I'm paying for this card, I'm getting much more value out of it than I'm paying into it. So why shouldn't I play it?
Right, and we see that right now with a lot of other just cards like Magnamon X Antibody, where some people might see that you need to have armor forms, and if you're not running the particular Digimon armor forms are lesser, but we have ways to still be able to mitigate those costs thanks to cards like the training cards. It's like, okay, I might not be paying 3 for it, but 1 is pretty good. It's not insane, but it's still pretty good. And then you get aces like Valkyrie Ace and Vike Ace, where it's just like they're just so absurdly disruptive that it's just like, yeah, that there's no reason for me not to use it because it just is that good. And that's why a card like EX5 Edamon is like incredibly dangerous, because it's forcing the opponent to fall into the ace trap, when that's something they normally have to think about is, oh, should I make this attack because they might have the ace? How can I get rid of this body to prevent the ace? Like, it's stuff like that where on the more macro scale of the game itself, that's where the game warpingness comes from. And Dragon Ball Super Masters is no shy to this at all, because they had unisons. That was a huge power creep point that changed the foundation of the game. And then they have basically an extra deck. I'm blanking, a Zenkai deck. That's what it's called. And that's kind of similar to how Force of Will did a side, like they had a specific like leader type card that had a built-in side deck that you could just access whenever, and that was incredibly broken back then for that game. So it's stuff like this that really starts to get out of hand when it's not properly done in a very tasteful manner. I think when Aces first started, they were kind of fine, and now they're getting to the point where it's just like, oh, these are actually highly problematic.
Well, to your point on a lot of game design centering around cheesing the resource system, I feel like that becomes very problematic, but I don't think the designers can help themselves a lot of times, which leads to uh, just for example, I know in Yu-Gi-Oh, there's a lot of cards that are like, oh, this monster can't be normal summoned or or can't be special summoned or set. It has to be, and then here's a big long like 4 sentence paragraph explaining exactly how all of the steps you must follow in order to summon this monster. Essentially, like, oh hey, you can't cheese it out because there's 10 million ways you can cheese it out. So you have to do this very specific way to cheese it out, but we'll still let you cheese it out. It's almost like the designers understand that. I mean, we already talked about Yu-Gi-Oh not really having a resource, but I mean, many games do that where it's just like, well, we know the resource generation is absolutely busted, and you can just cheese stuff out, and it's like, well, I'm gonna get insane value for a card that should not be getting this much insane value. I mean, I remember back, a buddy of mine was showing me his one modern deck, and the whole point of the deck was to put Emrakul, the Aeon's Thorn, into your grave, and then just pull Emrakul out with a resurrection card that only costs like 2 or 3 to play. And it's just like, oh hey, I dropped Emrakul. There's nothing that says that I can't. Oh hey, Emrakul says I can take an extra turn, so it doesn't matter that it came out tapped when I brought it out, so because I'm gonna untap it during my extra turn. I'm gonna swing for 15, Annihilator 6. You know, no answers? Well, I guess you just die.
Right. And like it is just unfortunate that games eventually will seem to magically want to get to that state where it's just, but like the flip side of that coin is like going to some fighting game mentality where it's just like, well, if everything's broken, then nothing is broken. And sometimes that could be a really interesting experience, but usually we kind of just like this goes to a huge culture clash because a lot of TCGs are, shocker, made in Japan. And Japan, they love big, spicy, splashy, hype moments. And that feeds into being able to cheat on the resource system as efficiently and effectively as they possibly can, because that's what's creating that hype moment is like, oh man, I feel like I'm down, I could lose next turn, so I gotta make this turn the turn. And then you make the turn and you end up winning the game because of just what you were able to accomplish based on how much resource you were trying to cheat. Um, and Yu-Gi-Oh has its own levels of cheating on its own native resource system because like the OG Yu-Gi-Oh was, it almost was like an action point resource where it's just like I get one of this type of action, one of this type of action. It was definitely a lot slower compared to what it is now. And now that there's like all of these different types of summonings and they tried to change the rules of the game to accommodate some of the new card designs, and it got to be like such a big mess that they just were like, yeah, no, we broke the game so efficiently that we just can't like we can't control the game anymore. And that's the really sad part. And I'm not saying Digimon is anywhere near that level. We're just in our infancy of starting that. Like it probably took Dragon Ball Super about, oh god, probably about 15 sets before like the game really was absolutely cracked. It was starting to get cracked at around set like 7 or 8, but for whatever reason, the designers for the most part for Digimon have done a pretty decent job. They've made a couple of mistakes, and their mistakes have probably been more egregious than what reasonably should have been. But compared to a lot of other games, like Digimon's actually done a pretty decent job at trying to control and mitigate its power creep as much as it possibly could. It's not immune to it, but it's at least on a slower pace compared to a lot of other games.
Well, I'd be hard pressed for you to tell me a game that has been immune to power creep because over time it's just going to happen. But kind of on the topic of trying to mitigate cards becoming staples, uh, are there any thoughts that you have on strategies to kind of mitigate certain cards becoming world staples?
Um, It's mostly like, as stupid as this is going to sound, it's mostly just don't mess with the resource system of the game, because most world staples are resource based. So it's just like Pot of Greed as the Yu-Gi-Oh example. That's a world level staple because every deck can run Pot of Greed. It just draws you 2 cards. It's a +1 to your hand. So there's no reason never to not run it, especially when your hand is the most valuable resource in that type of a game. With Digimon, it's the memory system. Like, cheating on the memory system is definitely one of the most felt experiences in the game, where it's just like, oh, I put you to one memory. I'm limiting how much you could possibly do in your turn because I'm putting you at the very minimum amount of resource I can functionally give you. And then you just make this huge play that generates a whole bunch of memory, and you were able to do everything you wanted to do anyway, even off of that low amount, which the game used to be designed around 3 memory being the necessary amount in order to make your plays. But with all of the ways that the game has introduced on cheating its resource system, they've, I guess, decreased the amount of needed memory to 1. Certain decks still want to function at 3, and 3 is like that sweet spot still. But the way that certain decks play out, 1 is all you need in order to make your big stupid Unga Bunga combo. I say this as a ex Mirage Gaugamon player. That deck is one of the few decks that could just print memory. And then you get like older decks like Bloomlord and Plants and Fairies that had the ability to print memory. You had BT14 Patamon that prints memory in the most egregious of ways, which is why, like, looking at the ban and restriction list, a lot of the cards on that are because they're too fast and too efficient with how they're playing with the resource system. Like, almost all of them.
So currently the big issue is everything needs to cheese memory like there's no tomorrow. So they're starting to just create staples so all the colors just have access to the same resource generation engines.
Right. And part of the problem as far as like what rises to the top is just the good decks only got better because of these types of staples. Because I know a lot of the big argument that a lot of people have is just like, oh, but the game needs these staples for the smaller guys to be able to be competitive against the bigger guys. And my reaction in response to that is always no. Like, just no. Like, I don't care about the little Timmy deck because the Spike deck is just always going to be better no matter what. And staples sometimes can actually increase that power gap. It's just like, oh, it just puts more of a burden on the Timmies to be able to get all of the staples in order to at least be think about being competitively viable. That's why everyone really hated Death X when it first came out, was because it was one of the biggest, most egregious black-eyed staples because it was slotted at a high rarity point, and with no real reprint, if you didn't have that card, you were just SOL. And Shine Greymon Ruin mode is in that same type of a camp where it's just like, it's just that good of a level 7 that could be splashed into a lot of decks because it can digivolve off of 2 colors. And with a lot of Digimon being already 2 colors, it kind of makes colors start to be irrelevant, which was a fear I've always had. But I think like that's a different topic for a different time. But it just goes to show when you have that strong of a card that everyone wants to use, it doesn't decrease the power gap between decks because the better deck was always going to be better from an initial design standpoint.
And now that you've added this powerful staple, like you said, it's just better than it was. So it's like, it has that commonality of just like, well, let's say this deck is a 9, this deck is a 5. Oh, hey, we wanna bump up that deck that's a 5, but we're gonna print this generic staple that puts it up to a 7. Oh, hey, guess what? That 9 deck can also run that same staple, so now it's gonna bump up to an 11. What did you succeed in doing? Absolutely nothing. And it kind of goes back to my point earlier of if you're going to make these kind of generic staples that everyone can use, you need to make the value for cost ratio to use them higher than what they would be if they were archetype specific. Because if everybody can run them, they're going to. If you're going to get absolute unga bunga value out of this card, I mean, you're just going to be stupid for not running it.
And the silly thing is, the way that some of the Digimon like cards are designed is like some of them are like testing grounds where we had from Master to Disciple, which was a older starter deck card for Jesmon that was the prelude to what the training cards were doing in terms of cost and effectiveness, but the training cards are still better than the in archetype card because the in archetype card came first and that was like their test. So we haven't really seen an. I'm almost afraid because when we do get in archetype cards like Emissary of Hope, that just allows you to cheese on the resource system by so much. It really starts to warp the foundation of the game around the usage of these. And like I said earlier, like Digimon was initially designed off of you being at 3 memory. That's why all of the memory setting tamers put you to 3 memories, because that's what they think you're going to be playing at and design the cards based around that. And now that we have cards that basically let you operate on 1 memory, it's like, think how much more you can do with 2 extra memory that you didn't exactly need. It just gives you more of a buffer, not necessarily for error, but for power to be done. So,
yeah, I mean, you're not wrong.
but like, Digimon is definitely really, like, they had a design team change. This was announced in uh pre this was announced at Nationals of 2023, which was in 2024 because that's how competitive years say it. And I really hope that this new design team really takes a hard look at what the old design team was doing and stops and just stares at just not necessarily the stupidity, but just the how poorly thought out things were. And some of that like poor level of thinking right now is definitely being felt and infecting a lot of other Bandai games. Like Fusion World was broken by set 2. One Piece, in my perspective, never had a good format, like a good healthy format with a lot of good diversity. So like you get these like really silly decisions that have the biggest impacts on the game, and Bandai doesn't like to admit their mistakes, which is why they try not to ban and limit things as much as they should. Magic, a lot of companies are more proud and they really don't like admitting those mistakes. But at least Bandai, when they do know that there was a mistake, they do own up to it. So at least there's that, but I don't know exactly where the next level of staples can go. Like, they've already introduced the ways to cheat on the resource system, make decks hyper consistent, even though some decks are still inconsistent. But regardless, like, they have already done so much with the few that they actually have introduced. So I'm cautious on where they can even go from here, and that kind of scares me, like, because it seems like they're trying to do it more often, which is something I think they shouldn't do.
Well, and on the topic of banning cards when stuff becomes problematic, it always becomes a bit of a guessing game on what cards are you actually going to ban in the decks that you're seeing it being problematic in. Because, I mean, I know that's a pretty common thing on trying to figure out what cards to ban, because it's just like, well, you know, if people are playing this deck specifically for playing this card, but this card we can't ban because everybody loves this card. And maybe the card that they're playing isn't necessarily the problem. Maybe it's something else that's the problem, and therefore we need to nerf that. Is it reasonable that we can nerf that? We need to do something. And I feel like on the topic of the universal staples, that becomes a really hard one because it's like, well, crap. This red deck right here is what is being problematic. It's obviously the staple card that's making it problematic. But if we ban it, then all the other colors, maybe one or two of them absolutely freaking need this to even be reasonably competitive. Do we
And
ban that card?
right, and they kind of did something similar with purple, where we had a couple of like really high resource value based cards that were just overreaching what they probably reasonably should have done. And they limited those, and all of the purple players were just up in arms. They were like, how could they do that? We needed that. And then Bandai was just like, but that was the problem to begin with. How do we actually make something that's better than this already? And the answer is we don't want to. So that's what warranted the card to get banned in the first place, is sometimes they just make that big of a mistake where it does warrant it getting banned, even though it will have that level of impact that's going to kneecap the color. Yellow is notorious at doing that because of the mechanics that it's playing with. It's always one step away from being broken. And it kind of sucks that it's just designed that way, but they were doing for a very long time a good ways to be able to not break the color as a whole.
Right, and like you said, it's a much more dangerous game when those cards become universal staples that everybody has access to. In the purple example, it nuked purple straight into the ground, but it only affected purple. If it's a universal colorless staple that gets nuked, you know, you could essentially kill 15, 20 decks across all the colors because some of the decks might just be running the staple because it's a win more card. I'm already like amazingly good. I'm just running this because I'm just getting insanely more value out of it. Do I absolutely need it for this deck to function? No. It just makes the deck function better, makes it more consistent. So I mean, certain decks it can easily can just drop the staple. It's like we could go to something else. Does it make the deck worse? Obviously. But other decks it's like, well, that was like the entire crux of my existence. You take this card out of the deck, it immediately drops from tier 1 to tier 2 and is practically unplayable.
Yeah.
So, if the designers are going to design a exuberant amount of these universal staples, they could very easily and very quickly run into those kinds of problems where it's like, oh, yeah, that staple is the problem. Banning it is literally going to destroy a third of the meta decks.
And that, like, anytime a company needs to ban or limit cards, it's always the hardest decision, especially depending on how fast that they need it to happen, because the faster it happens, the more damage it could potentially cause, which is why companies generally play that sit and wait approach to see if there's anything, and if there is, what it is, and they just need that time to be able to actually examine the problems. And some of them are staple related and some of them are engine related. So it's like it's not necessarily always the fault of the staple, because sometimes the staple is what's enabling the engine, but the engine was always prone to be a problem to begin with.
Right, it's like slapping a turbo on your car, makes it nice and loud, makes it go fast, but the turbo is just making it go that much better. The engine may have already been absolutely great to start with.
Yeah. And like there's just a lot of comparisons between like staples and between all of the different games and how they all approach it, cuz each game will have their own set of staples. That's just an inevitability. And they will have a profound and immediate impact on the overall game because, just as another example, Buddy Fight had some like game warping level staples that every card needs because it could be ran in every archetype, and they just printed a anniversary set for, even though the card game is dead, reading some of those cards, basically they introduced a way with a staple to have almost every single deck OTK in the game. And that was incredibly powerful and incredibly stupid. And now all of the staples that they are just introducing try to remove the OTKs. So now you have the staple that you need because that's how you're winning the game. And now you have the staple that you need because that's how you're not losing the game. And it's really interesting on like how these games play out based on these staples that are emerging. And like Digimon thankfully doesn't have too many as of yet, but it very easily could, and it seems like they're trying to find more creative ways to introduce them. I just hope that whatever they end up doing, they at least make them more accessible so that way whoever is coming into the game isn't going to be immediately gatewalled because they need 15 staples before they even start building their deck. And Digimon doesn't exactly have that much deck space to play with when it comes to what the core and the engine is, because Digimon's deck design compared to a lot of other games is actually that much different, because you have to take into account evolutions, your combo plays, how the deck is trying to function to begin with and what it even needs, on top of what it's allowed to play based on the archetype and color that it is. So it definitely is a very interesting experience when it comes to deck building that just not a lot of players are good at, and not a lot of players are going to be good at. But staples sometimes make that easier, and sometimes that's not as fun. And like, but that also has the inverse effect of potentially gatewalling players from even attempting to play.
Well, and from a game design perspective too, I mean, if you're designing a set and obviously you're designing a few sets in advance of whatever set is currently out, but if the current set that's out, you're noticing, oh, hey, this deck seems to be pretty problematic right now in the current meta because it just has crazy resource generation that none of the other decks have access to. What is an easy, solution from a game design perspective? Well, obviously all the other decks need better resource generation. What's the easiest way to do that? Oh, we'll just make a generic card that every deck can run, because then we only have to design one card instead of, okay, well, we need to design a card for yellow, but this is how yellow generally generates its resources, so we have to keep that in mind. And oh, hey, this is how purple generates its resources, so we have to design a card that keeps that in mind. Whereas that's any color that needs that card added to it, it's like, oh crap, that's one card per color that's added into the set, and it's like that card may not exactly be usable in every single deck of that color. Yeah, this is the general overall what this color wants to do, but it doesn't necessarily mean every deck of that color is doing that specific thing. So it's like, oh, we'll just design one card, any deck can run it, we'll just make it quote unquote colorless. It's so generic that it doesn't matter what color you throw it in. It's just that easy, it's that good, it's that useful. So I mean, from a game design perspective, what incentive do the designers have to make less staple cards like that when it's so easy to do?
It is, and from a player psychology perspective, players love it when things are buffed, not nerfed. Like it's really funny because TCGs are like almost the exact opposite of like fighting games in that perspective, where players want their characters to be stronger. They don't want them to be weaker. But in TCGs, we literally all the time will ask for bans because something is just profoundly wrong. And like player psychology always says that we want the dopamine versus the I don't even know what the chemical for injury is, but whatever chemical causes injury, or like the sensory of injury in our brain, like that's kind of like the comparison. We want things to be buffed, which is why it's easier to create those types of cards to begin with, because it's buffing everything across the board, which is like like both a good and a bad thing. But I think like at the end of the day, what really defines a good global or universal staple versus a bad one comes down to cost and efficiency. Is the card too cheap to use? And does it do too much? Because when balance is taken into consideration, things need to have a pro and a con to it. They need to have their checks and balances. Ace has overflow. That was the initial design of trying to balance aces. You could digivolve for free on the opponent's turn, but you're going to end up paying it back when the Digimon ends up leaving the field. So, like, there is a push and pull dynamic to that type, whereas something like training cards, there is none. Like, it just is super cheap, super efficient, and has immediate, profound, high levels of impact, especially in specific style or types of decks, because if you have a card that's just gaining you resource on evolution, you make that free with the training card, and now you're gaining even more resources because of you just using that card in not necessarily an unintended way, but in a way that most decks weren't able to keep up with.
Well, you see, the problem here is you're thinking too inside the box. You're thinking too much with proper game design thinking in mind. If I need to design a card that's obviously really good, it's not balanced. The simple solution is oh, hey, I'm just going to slightly move the curve up. Oh, hey, look at that, the new power curve. I'm dead on the new power curve. To heck with the old power curve. That's not relevant anymore.
No, and that's why Bandai tends to replace everything with like what I label as waterfall rotation. So it's like the newer stuff generally wants to try to be more powerful than the older stuff, but the older stuff is still kind of powerful where it's still relevant, and then it'll eventually be phased out because it just no longer is relevant, hasn't received any meaningful updates, and even though the staples help it stay playable, it just gets weaker and weaker as the sets progress, which is why usually when they hit specific cards, they'll target decks that have remained in the meta too long. And even though that's like a really bad excuse and a bad feeling, it's like it is kind of true. That goes to show that that's how much more powerful that was compared to everything else, especially with some support and especially with the inclusion of the staples.
Well, and from a game design perspective, just slightly bumping up that curve every once in a while gives players an incentive to want to buy the new product. If the old stuff always stays relevant, I mean, yeah, the new stuff might be better, but it's like, well, I don't really feel like, buying the new stuff. I can still run the old stuff. I mean, from a game design, not really from a game design perspective, but from a marketing company perspective, there's always that, always that thought in the back burner. It's like, well, how is this set going to, push more product out the door? What's going to make players want to pick up these new cards, put them in their deck? Which is why I think it's hard for a game long term not to have that power creep, because it's just like, well, if everything's viable, then it's like, what incentive do the players have to continue buying the product, which in turn is funding the game for new sets down the line.
Yeah, that's a very fair assessment. I think like Digimon had a period where I honestly felt like they understood the power ceiling and the power dynamic of the game, and they were trying not to eclipse that. And then they, like 2 sets later, eclipsed it, and I was just like, "Yep, there it is." I was waiting for it. Like it's almost like clockwork at times on when and how they decide to introduce that creep point. In Force of Will, it was always like the third set. Like the third set was always the strongest out of the 4-set block. So, like Digimon's obviously not Force of Will. It's different. It operates on different rules, and it's way more random when it happens. But it usually there's at least one set out of the year that is the power set. And it's not necessarily always going to be just let's update something that was already strong, or let's create a staple. Sometimes it's just the new stuff is just that much better because, like you said, they're just trying to increase that bar and try to make things more interesting, because if they have an in-engine option to do something similar to what a staple is doing, they would rather use the in-engine option. So that's kind of like them trying to figure out a way to be able to not necessarily make staples irrelevant, but make it so that they could try to coexist at the same time and not completely ruin deck design because of just the existence of staples. Like right now, we're still playing with a lot of floodgates because we just need to, and they need to do better on, at least if they're going to do that, print the same type of floodgate in every single color, and they have yet to do that for a single type of floodgate, and it drives everyone crazy. So I think that's kind of just a good, like, discussion on staples. There's probably more to explore in, like, the staple design space. I know we haven't exactly, like, created any staples ourselves or done anything fun like that, but this is just more of I guess, a retrospective on just what defines a staple, how staples are used, and just, you know, the
How having
impacts.
too many universal staples can sometimes hamper the game.
Yeah, and the impacts that staples have. So I want to take this time to not only just thank you, Mark, for coming on for this episode, but thank you, listeners, for making it all the way towards the end. It really does mean a lot. If you want to support the podcast, remember, do all the social media doobly doos. And with that, we will see you next time.